Tonight we're going to learn about the process by which the Lord prepares His chosen heroes before He brings them to prominence. We had a series, as some of you remember, of Christian Heroes workshops back in 2005 and 2006. They proved to be among the most productive things we've ever done in men's ministry. And we filmed those. We are doing the same thing tonight, so we'll be able to use them. But there is a process, a classical process, and I've made up for you a checklist. This checklist is titled, as you'll notice before you, it's called the Hallmarks of God's Chosen Heroes. There are two parts. First, a typical Christian hero has certain character attributes. So we're talking about the attributes of God as applied to men. We call those the communicable attributes of God, don't we? The second thing that we're going to talk about in this checklist ever so quickly is the process, and sometimes it is a very painful process, by which the Lord sometimes humbles and certainly machines down heroes. Sometimes the process is exceedingly painful. We have a question often in men's ministry of people recommending current contemporary heroes for heroes' profiles. We don't do them because they haven't finished their lives. One of the most regrettable parts of prominence is that we become filled with ourselves. And most Christians have lives that are full of epochs, ups and downs. It's the rare Christian man who progresses pretty generally throughout his life, more like a tram going up the mountain. Tragically, we have these big falls, which bring great dishonor unto the Lord. So we're very careful about the heroes that we use. Okay, let's look at this list for a moment. Here are some of the things that we have found are most common in a Christian hero. First is discernment. Notice what we said. This is the ability of some great men to see and sense danger ahead. The masses never will, never have. God's heroes typically do. I think immediately of the great John Knox of Scotland. His contemporaries said that when they were high as a kite, he was worried. He saw what they didn't see. And when they were just crestfallen and beaten down, he was already seeing the next move upward. That is a characteristic of the great heroes. The second one, I think we all know this, is a powerful sense of God's calling. What's calling? It's the sense of compulsion that some men have that other men never will. A calling is often a call to sacrifice self for a cause much greater than self. Often calling is synonymous with duty. We don't see a lot of that in our time. The next area is adversity. Typically, God proves up the character and purifies the character of great men with adversity. I think of Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was described by his contemporaries, Mark, as the Cicero of America. If you know something about the history of Rome, you know that was the mountaintop man. He was the noblest of the Romans. He was also a golden-tongued orator. And the contemporaries of a young Patrick Henry in his 20s were calling him the Cicero of America. What's that going to do to a guy's hat size? He went broke twice in his 20s. And his beloved wife, Sally, went insane. It's part of the process. But after all of that, Patrick Henry was a man who listened carefully. Personal pain and affliction, you see that here. We call that the Lord's crucible for creating great character. Here's a classical one, you notice? Wrestling with crises of conscience. Can you think of any great Christian heroes who have had absolutely the greatest decisions to make that double them over in pain and concern. Anybody come to mind, those of you who have been around this heroes topic? Remember Robert E. Lee? Robert E. Lee and George Washington had tremendous crises. Robert E. Lee was said by his wife to have paced the floor. She could hear him on the second floor of their home, back and forth, back and forth. Then she would hear the thud as his knees hit the hardwood floor, and he was down on his knees praying. Went on for days. A crisis of conscience on what to do about becoming the commander of the Confederate Army and having to fight against his West Point classmates. I mean, there are some things that are decisions almost bigger than a man has to make. And Robert E. Lee had a sterling character that the Lord had shaped in him through incredible adversity. Here's one: persecution or entrenched opposition. This is a typical means of hardening up a hero's resolve. He has to be able to handle opposition from friends and dear ones, people whose opinions count. Integrity. A man's word is his bond. We didn't need to have thousands and thousands of attorneys in every county back in the era when greatness was so obvious in America. Here's one: biblical decision making. That one is a prerequisite for God to bless any enterprise. Next one: a strong sense of bond servanthood. What we said here cryptically is no free agents allowed. Many Christians today believe that we're free essentially to do as we wish. The sense of obligation or calling is very uncommon today. Self-sacrifice, a strong spiritual discipline, humbling and discouragement. Again, I think of Patrick Henry. Utter dependability, the idea of a word being his bond. Timeliness, dependability. A strong conviction of biblical ethics. Is that typical today? That's one of the things, you remember, Dale, that Zach, our director of men's ministry, wanted so badly for us to have in our biblical worldview roundtables, biblical ethics. Remember when he came here in June to talk about economic ethics. An unusual endowment of wisdom. We said here that's a strong ability to anticipate consequences accurately. There's a word for that. It's to predicate. To predicate means, what, Nick? If we do this, then that's going to happen. It's the ability to foresee the end of a matter. That's one of the reasons that we talk so much about biblical fathering. It's really your job, isn't it? To develop wise sons and daughters who see the consequences of their actions early, can make mid-course corrections. Here's another one: personal purity, an absolute prerequisite to the Lord's prolonged blessing. Nick, you and I have discussed that one. I remember that's something that about which you feel extremely strongly, correctly so. A significant sense of selflessness. That's to become a Philippians 2 Christian, thinking about the welfare of others. It was an uncanny thing that though Robert E. Lee was the most famous man in the South, and he was the paramount man in the Confederate Army, he was the head servant. You saw it again and again and again. Even within a military structure, this man was solicitous about the welfare of others. You remember the time when, after winning a battle, he and his staff were going back to their position, and a wounded Union soldier called out of the weeds where he was bleeding, cursing Robert E. Lee. What would normally happen if you cursed a military man in a circumstance where he's surrounded by AIDS? He'd be history. Robert E. Lee dismounted, gentlemen. He got off his horse at great personal risk. Dale cradled the man's head in his arms, comforted the man, thinking he was probably dying. Is, is that Christ-like? Is that a matter of being selfless, putting oneself at risk? That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Only really great men do those great things. A seeming fearlessness. Now this one is way overrated, James. Fearlessness. We tend to think we impute mythical qualities to heroes. We shouldn't do that. A great hero will have fear. He will see dire consequences. He's not blinding himself to reality, but he moves through the situation. An unwavering trust in the Lord, his Lord and King. And a final one is also not common in our era. It's a very unusual thing. We call it being a holder of a high view of God. We have a pygmy view of our God compared to the great times in history. We have a tendency to make him but a man. There's the balance, isn't there, between the Lord's humanity and his divinity. We have a great tendency to fall off the balance beam and make him much like ourselves. So these are some of the things that we're going to see tonight and then again in December. And a date for you men who just came in, the third Thursday night is December 16. So for 2 sessions, we're going to be going over about a half dozen profiles of great heroes. I wish you would tonight keep this in hand. Make check marks, or better yet, thing we've suggested in the past, is put an initial. If you hear something about our first hero, J.S. Bach, that reminds you of one of these hallmarks, put JSB, initial it. What you're going to find after 2 sessions, there's going to be an incredible parallel from hero to hero to hero. So I think that's going to make this much more real. Then at the end, we'll have some time for discussion. Tonight, because of the fact that we are filming these, we're going to need to move along very quickly. Our first hero will surprise you. It surprised me that in the series called Leaders in Action, the editors chose to place this next hero. We'll know why in 15 or 20 minutes after our friend Steve Cherry has told us about Johann Sebastian Bach. Do you know much about Bach? I'd almost bet my life that you know almost nothing. Steve has had a passion for the idea, some of you know this, of having a committee of Christians involved in the fine arts, because the arts tend to be a culture shaper that the Lord's used many times.
Well, first off, I'd like to thank John for giving me this assignment, because John was the one that suggested this. I've been a musician all my life. My parents were musicians before me and still are. Taught me a high value of music. But I'm going to admit something tonight, and that is that guys that look like this in black and white pictures with wigs and stuff, they just didn't interest me too much when I was a kid, you know, and I would see them in my history books and we'd talk about them, and I knew they were legendary people, but I really didn't pay a lot of attention to them when I was a kid, even though I was a musician. And so when I picked up this book, I'm glad John said that he was surprised about what this would teach you, because it taught me a lot and I learned things that I'd never heard, never knew about this guy. So Johann Sebastian Bach is the subject that we're going to talk about. I'm doing a book review of this book called Glory and Honor, The Musical and Artistic Legacy of Johann Sebastian Bach. I'm going to refer to him a lot as Sebastian because he came from a long lineage of Johann Bachs in his family. Even his uncle, who had twin sons, were named Johann. So everybody tended to go by their middle name in this family, I can just tell you that. So this is the handout. There's more in the middle of this table over here if anybody needs one that didn't get one. I'm gonna blast through this pretty quick just so that we make sure that we stay on time, and hopefully if we have time for a couple of questions at the end, we'll go there. So the author is Greg Wilbur, 260 pages. It's almost like one of those old-fashioned Big Little books It's small pages, so you kind of burn through it pretty quick, but it's very full of anecdotes and stories and history. One thing that came to life for me was this timeline that I'd like you to take a brief look at. I started it out in 1500 because Bach was shaped very much by Luther and his Reformation. And as you read this book, you'll discover that much of the making of Bach, of Sebastian Bach, had to do with Luther's Reformation theology, where he basically tore down the barriers between worshipers and God and said, you can have a personal God and you can approach God personally. So, but it's interesting that Bach was born in 1685, about the same time that something else was being born, and that was something called the Enlightenment period. And something that this book does extremely well is it showcases Bach's life and his legacy within the history and the formation of this Enlightenment thinking, which really comprised itself of a pushback against Luther and Reformation thinking, and saying that the Enlightenment thinkers said that human reasoning can pull you through and can get you where you need to go and can take you to the next step. Human reasoning will redeem you, not all the spiritual stuff. So the book's divided into 3 parts. The first part talks about the life and work of Johann Sebastian Bach. He's, like I said, he's the heir and culmination of a long line of family musicians. He's steeped, he grows up inside Lutheran theology, okay? He's taught early on that music was of very high value and that it was a major component to worship God and to communicate theological concepts, not just to be up on a stage producing music for music, but actually producing intellectually rigorous theological concepts, okay? Think of that. His home was always open to the ailing and needy relatives. During the time of the plague, people were moving around a lot because they simply lost their lives quickly. People were orphaned, and that's going to come up to haunt Mr. Bach later on. The home is also the center of professional music in town because remember, his family is a long line of professional musicians, and that's what they do for a living. His mother dies at the age of 9. When he's 9, she dies. Less than a year later, his father is dead. Boom. I mean, how fast can you get hit in life, right? So at the age of 9, then age of 10, just before his 10th birthday, he's orphaned, okay? In that day and age, there was other Bach family to go to. He went and moved to the family of his older brother who had already left the family at the ripe age of 15. So he goes to live with his brother Christoph, also first named Johann, of course, and it's there that he begins to really develop this musical talent. I mean, he just explodes while he's living in this town of Ohrdruf with his brother Christoph. One of the stories that this book tells is that Christoph had a scroll of music, a manuscript, and it was very highly valued. Scrolls, manuscripts, anything written, books were very of high value during this time because they were hard to come by and it took a long time to create them. So he would not allow young Sebastian to use this. Sebastian was learning how to play the clavier, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and he was being taught these various instruments like violin and the harpsichord. And so Christoph wouldn't allow him to use this manuscript because it's too valuable. And so Bach turns out to be this very resourceful person. He really wants to learn music, and he wants to learn advanced music. So he goes in at night into this little cupboard and spindles this manuscript through the lattice work. This is all in the dark of night, pulls it out, and begins copying it on moonlit nights. He has no light of his own, so he picks moonlit nights to copy this by hand, and he finishes it and begins learning this music on his own on the clavier. His brother Christoph finds out about this, takes the new manuscript away from him, and locks the other one up for good, and he doesn't see it again until 20 years later when Christoph dies. This is what we're talking about as far as what this young man's dealing with and what he goes through to begin. That's a good way to think of how he starts out. Okay. The author of the book says if there had been no Martin Luther, there would have been no Bach. He was weaned on Luther's catechism, read Luther's German Bible, and he composed music for Luther's chorales. Now, Martin Luther, it's important to know what Martin Luther thought on this, because Martin Luther influenced Bach. Martin Luther's words, "Next to the Word of God, music deserves the highest praise. I plainly judge and do not hesitate to affirm that except for theology, there is no art that could be put on the same level with music." Luther preached that he wouldn't even allow pastors to come into the church unless they were properly schooled in music. That's how highly he thought of the art of music at that time. Skipping to page 2, talking on part 2 of the book, deals with the character of Johann Sebastian Bach, and this was where I found so many of the great stories and examples. And these are the areas where you're going to find that they match up really well with John's hallmarks of God's chosen heroes that he gave you, this list here. Some of the character that was developed in Johann Sebastian Bach that I found in this book, he was accessible. Many of God's heroes were accessible. They were incredible at what they did, but they were very incredibly accessible as well to common people, regular people like you and me. He writes music people can understand, but today the scholars and the experts, the highbrows, still can't plumb the depth of what Bach did. They're still digging through it and wondering what in the world was this guy all about. He was a supercomputer musician. So he was frustrated in his desire to finish university. He never finished formal schooling, didn't go to Juilliard, any of those fancy things, because he didn't have money, and he was frustrated by that, and it plagued him later on because people picked on him for it. So that affected him later on. He had great humility. He participated in contests where he blew people away, but yet he was unwilling to really dig into that and say, look what I did. He was extremely remarkable, remarkably unconcerned with his own success. He had adhered to pure and strict truth even when it was not politically expedient to do so. And it said that he proceeded with so much conscientiousness and impartiality that he seldom added to the number of his friends by this. Okay, think about that. He didn't make friends just to make friends. The primary text in his school were the Bible, hymnal, and the catechism. All three of these were integrated very tightly with what was called the medieval trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Those three words rarely enter into our schooling that we see today. Our kids don't come home and tell us about the rhetoric and the logic that they learned. Long-suffering and Leipzig. I noted this. Leipzig was his long period of professional service. He was the third chosen person in Leipzig because he didn't have a formal education. And Leipzig was where he really found that embedded, deep-seated opposition of the Enlightenment thinkers. And so he was under three bosses. They all thought differently. They all condescended to him all the time and just gave him a really tough run of it in Leipzig. So during this time period, he was prepared for an accepted death. And I want to read one quick segment in here that illustrates this really well. Bach was surrounded by loss all through his life. And you need to know that to really understand his character. So it says here, by the time Bach was 7 years old, 2 siblings and a cousin who lived with Bach's family had died. Bach's mother and father died 6 months apart, leaving him an orphan at the age of 10. Bach's first wife bore 7 children, of whom only 4 survived childhood. Within a 9-year time span, Bach lost 3 children, his wife, Maria Barbara, and his 2 remaining brothers. Anna Magdalena, Bach's second wife, gave birth during each of the first 7 years in Leipzig. This was in 1723, starting there. 4 children did not reach their 4th birthday. During the period from 1726 to 1730, he lost a child in each year but 1729. Of the 20 children Bach had with both of his wives, only 9 survived. I should say 9 survived him. Okay? What tremendous loss. I mean, can you imagine what if any of us went through this, we would, yet this is a guy who is so prolific that people look back and go, how did he do this? He produced nearly 1,000 works that are still out there being dug into today. And out of those works, the manuscripts that he produced, we're in the tens of thousands of pages of the stuff produced. So the book finishes by talking about the legacy of Johann Sebastian Bach. The legacy of Johann Sebastian Bach is much greater than the period that he lived in, because when Bach died in Leipzig, he was so hated by the people that employed him that they buried him with no marker and no eulogy after all that he did. He worked there for 27 years, I think it was. So, and for the final insult, at 27 years, the widow of a public servant like Bach would normally get some kind of a pension type of payment to take care of them. They discovered that 27 years ago when he actually started in the month of February. And so they docked him the pay from the time that he started to February to his widow. And left, the only remarks that were left in the public record were disparaging to this poor man after what he did. That's how much the people of the Enlightenment thinking hated what he was doing. And so I'm going to wrap up here pretty quickly. See if anybody has any questions on the paper at all. A couple quotes by Wagner and Schumann. Wagner said that Bach was the most stupendous miracle in all music. Schumann said music owes to Bach almost as great a debt as a religion